Hey, welcome to the Wine Talks with Paul Kalemkiarian, and joining the growing number of enthusiasts with our podcast. So excited to be part of this program. By the way, this episode brought to you by the Pure Wine Club series at the Original Wine of the Month Club, where we've been curating wines for 48 years for our members. But this episode is really fascinating for us because one of the wineries I've always enjoyed for many, many years, and going back to the first time I featured one of the wines in 1993, is the Monticello Estates. It was also Corley Family Vineyards. Is that what it was founded as?
Yes.
So I have Chris Corley here, the winemaker, and I almost got lost in the conversation, didn't start the tape here because it was having such a fascinating time with listening about the history, but we were discussing a little bit. Your dad was from Chicago.
That's right. Yeah, he was born and raised in Chicago.
And he came to the West Coast.
Came out to the West Coast in the 50s. My grandfather had a meat slicing business in Chicago, so we've always kind of been involved a little bit in industry. So he had a meat slicing.
Wait, meat slicing.
Well, he had a machine company, and so he developed meat slicers that would slice meat and then put it into styrofoam and then wrap the cellophane around it. That was my grandfather's patent.
In the 50s?
Yeah. Well, in the 60s.
60s even.
So his company was pretty successful, and Hobart, which was a competing company in Ohio, got notice of what he was doing, and they ended up buying his company.
Wow.
So my dad had a good business background from observing his dad in Chicago. And my dad left Chicago when he was young and came out to Stanford in the 50s. Got a degree there and then ended up in Southern California where he started a number of businesses.
Wow. So Stanford College, obviously. He went to school there and got his degree in...
Got his degree in business.
Business? Yeah. Oh, so came to L.A.
Came to L.A. and started a number of businesses in Los Angeles, all of which were successful.
Like what part? Like downtown, or?
He lived in, I don't know that area. I guess Muirfield Road, Rimpaw, kind of.
Gee, I don't even know that myself. I've been here all my life.
Kind of near La Brea, I guess.
Oh yeah, La Brea, sure, okay. Yeah. Which is a totally different part of town then than it is now, of course, as most places.
And so he had a number of businesses, and he was kind of an entrepreneur before that word became trendy. And in the mid '60s, late '60s. He was very interested in wine, and he loved the wines of Burgundy. So Pinot Noir and Chardonnay were really what he was excited about. And he decided to go to Pepperdine, got his MBA at Pepperdine, and wrote his thesis on how to start a winery in the Napa Valley, which was pretty forward-thinking. Our dad was a very forward-thinking guy. And that thesis at Pepperdine ended up being our business plan, and we still follow a lot of the main business principles that he set out 50 years ago.
That is, to me, is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
Particularly when you write a thesis, you're not necessarily thinking this is going to be something, but he obviously loved wine. And I'm even more interested in the idea that he liked Burgundy, because back then in the 60s, I mean, Burgundy was here, of course, and it was certainly, in fact, the very first vintages that my dad featured in the Wine of the Month Club in 1972 were 4 Chablis. And, there was a fascination about it with my father as well. So, but to take it to Napa Valley is a very interesting thing, because you don't consider the Burgundy varietals.
No.
We all grow them there, but they're not the mainstay. They don't seem to be the mainstay of.
No, they're not. But if we look at Napa Valley in the context of what it looked like in 1970, it was a very different place. So when our dad bought the property up there, a lot of Napa Valley was prunes and figs and walnut trees.
Wow.
Because a lot of the vineyards that were planted in the late 1800s were torn out due to Prohibition. Wine grapes lost a lot of their value, so people tore the vineyards out, planted other crops. Our dad's interest in the wines of Burgundy specifically brought him to where Monticello is now. So we're in the southern end of Napa Valley in the Oak Knoll district.
Below Yountville.
So south of Yountville, we're just a little bit north of the city of Napa. And at that time, in 1970, that was as far south as anybody was thinking about growing grapes in Napa Valley. So his strategy at that time, and it was the right thinking given 1970 knowledge, was to plant the vineyard as far south as he could in Napa Valley, and that would be his best opportunity to make world-class Pinot Noir and Chardonnay.
Wow.
And sparkling wine. So we also make some sparkling wine. But over the last 50 years, we've figured out that we can grow some fantastic Cabernet Sauvignon,
for sure,
Cabernet Franc, Merlot, and Syrah, all in that same
Because, well, you're not too, I mean, Carneros district would be, considered the Burgundy part of Napa, and it's very close to there. You're on your way there anyway.
Yeah,
right?
we're about 10 minutes north of Carneros, and our Carneros is a little bit cooler than we are. When we planted our vineyard, Carneros was just a wetlands. Nobody was. It was a place that you drove through from San Francisco to get to Napa Valley.
So the idea of growing grapes in Napa really wasn't. I mean, and we were talking about this a little bit before, but Mondavi hadn't really started. You mentioned the Chapelets.
Yeah, right around the late 60s, there were a number of families that came into the valley. The Chapelets, the Davies family, resurrecting Schramsberg, Trefethen, which is a good neighbor of ours, and even Robert Mondavi. We'd talked about him just kind of branching away from his family in 1966. And so the late 60s and early 70s were a pretty exciting time in Napa, and kind of the beginning of, I would say, the second incarnation of Napa.
Because my dad, I was telling you a story. My dad went to Trinchero at Sutter Home in 1974 and tasted this pink wine with Bob, and this, he just made the mistake. I had Jim Barrett was a friend of ours in Palos Verdes, where my dad's store was. I think they bought Chateau Montelena in 69 or 70,
think right around there.
Something like that. Dave Stair was just sort of trying to figure out what to do with Dry Creek and the Russian River area, Dry Creek area. So I'm just trying to place it as like almost a real estate value deal. Like, what was going on there? If it was walnuts and those kinds of things, was it still an expensive area? Do you remember? Do you know? Or is it just sort of like farmland?
I won't divulge the
of course not. I don't want you to. No numbers, of course.
But I can tell you that the land in 1970 was
just farmland.
Very inexpensive compared to what it cost.
Just farmland.
It was just farmland, and I ran into the son of the guy that sold the property to our dad. So,
oh, really?
It was the other guy's son. So he told me with not too much humor in his voice. He said, "Yeah, it was one of the bigger mistakes my dad made was selling that property to you guys."
Of course.
And I said, I don't really know how to say this, but it was one of the best ideas that my dad ever had. So we kind of chuckled a little bit, and
that's really funny. So. Well, there's a property up the street here. I drive by every day, and I shoot myself because I was on the phone at an auction ready to buy it, and I didn't open my mouth. Now there's a Starbucks on there. That'll tell you what's going on.
It's like, when's the best time to plant a tree? It's 20 years ago. It's kind of the same thing with buying property.
That's true. So you said you weren't even born when your dad bought the property, but by the time you planted it, got a harvest going, you were of age to at least understand a little bit what was going on.
Yeah, so the winery was purchased and planted a couple years before I was born, and then the winery was built in 1981. I was about 10 years old. So for me, we've got 7 kids in the family as a whole. I'm number 6 out of 7. And for me, fortunately, the vineyard and winery has been part of my life, my entire life. Yeah. It's always been there, and it's been a very important part of my life.
So but is your education bootstrap cellar rat type education, or did you go to get your schooling in enology, or what did you do?
I did a little bit of both. I always spent a lot of time down at the vineyard. When I was a kid, I wasn't that interested in wine, as most teenagers really wouldn't be, but I loved going down to the vineyard. I'd ride the 3-wheeler ATV around
of course.
all over the place, and I loved being in the cellar. When I got a little bit older in high school, during the summers, I would work at the winery with my uncle, who was a carpenter from Scotland. He built a lot of the barrel racks and catwalks and whatnot. Wow. So I'd help him with those projects. And then when I got to be junior and senior in high school, I'd start working on the forklift and rolling the barrels around. And even then, my appreciation of wine hadn't quite started yet, but I loved driving the forklifts. I loved dumping the grapes during harvest, rolling the barrels around. I loved filling the barrels and smelling the brand new wine coming out of the barrel and all the fresh new oak. I just loved all those experiences. Wow. And when I graduated from high school, I took a brief 6 months, went up to Humboldt State to study marine biology because I was very interested in marine biology. And I realized after just a few months that I had made a mistake. What I recognized was I really love scuba diving. I don't necessarily want to study marine biology. And I realized that pretty quickly.
That's funny.
And I talked to my dad. I called our dad and I said, "Hey, I think I've made a mistake on my path here." And our dad was always very adamant that if you think you've made a mistake, we need to stop going forward, just stop, kind of get our bearings and try and get on the right path as quickly as we can. And I said, I'd like to come back down. I've really enjoyed my time working in the cellar during the summers and whatnot, and I'd like to come back to the winery. And he said, well, let's do it. Let's get on that path. So we talked about what that path would be to be a winemaker, and our dad was a pretty disciplined guy. Every path that was laid out, whether I went to UC Davis, Fresno, whatever school, if I was going to work in the family business, I started at the bottom. Didn't matter if I had a degree, no degree, a great degree, straight A's. I started at the bottom.
They don't do that these days. All the millennials want to start at the top.
And so for me, as a 18-year-old, I'm thinking, well, if I'm going to start at the bottom, no matter what, I think I want to get started right now. So I started working in the winery in January of 1990, just 6 months out of high school. And I took a bazillion classes. I took all the chemistry, biology I could at Santa Rosa Junior College, all the viticulture and enology classes at Napa College, every short course I could get my hands on at UC Davis. But really, I think the core of what I learned was working at the winery, learning from the winemakers that were there before me.
And who was that? Who did your dad make the wines when he started there, or
no,
did somebody else?
Our dad didn't make the wine. I think one of his great skills was he was a really smart guy, and I think one of the best things he knew was understanding what he didn't know. And he had a winemaker that he hired at that time, a young guy named Alan Phillips that was out of UC Davis. A very talented, creative guy, and he was the winemaker through the 80s. And then we had a couple of other winemakers through the 90s, and I took over as head winemaker in 2000.
So these young men that were in the other day that started this project called the Protege, which is a very nice wine. I think I touched on it briefly, but they were talking about how they went to high school, and roll call, or elementary school, maybe even preschool, and roll call would come up, and it was Mondavi, Trinchero, Chapelet. So these names that are iconic in the industry, and the grandsons now and the grandkids are part of that. Did you go to St. Helena, whatever? What were the schools there?
Yeah, I went through the whole public school system in St. Helena. I had a very similar, actually the same experiences to what you just described.
That's amazing.
A lot of the guys and ladies that I went to through primary school with, we had the same class. St. Helena is a very small town, so there's maybe 100 or 150 of us that were pretty much the same group of kids from kindergarten all the way through graduating from high school, and a lot of them are in the industry now, either whether they're in the winery or in the vineyards, or some of them in the restaurant industry. But
that's phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. I mean, would you have known? Would you even think back then? Now you're just a kid, but. What history was sort of iconically being made at this time.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. We've actually got, I've got a couple of friends where we've got 3 generations, a situation where my dad was very good friends with another vintner at the time. I was very good friends with his son, and now we both have sons that are in the same grade, and they're great friends. So it's
that's great.
We got 3 generations of buddies that have grown up together,
and it'll be interesting to see from your standpoint as a father the different baseline that they're working from, right? You went there, the industry was in its infancy. There wasn't this tourist trap, I'm sorry, didn't mean tourist trap, tourist destination that it is now, and it's very commercial in some places. And now your kids are growing up in an environment that's completely different. Yeah. Same industry, but completely different sort of.
Napa, the city of Napa has changed dramatically, just even in the last few years. The amount of restaurants and really wonderful hotels. We live up in St. Helena, and St. Helena is kind of an interesting place because it hasn't really grown in size at all. It's still, 7,000 people or so. It's about
main
the same.
drag right down the middle.
Yeah. It still has 3 stoplights, and it's about 7,000 residents. It's about the same size as it was when I was growing up there, 35 years ago. But the nature of the town has changed a lot.
Sure.
The restaurants are different. The tourism is, there's just a ton of people in there.
It's kind of necessary for
it's necessary,
economy.
And it drives our business. So I think a lot of the people that you talk to that are in the wine business and in the restaurant business understand that tourism is what drives our economy. It can get a little frustrating for some of the longtime residents that live there that might not necessarily be in the wine industry.
Yeah, right. Does that make
but
sense?
I think when everybody steps back and thinks about it, everybody realizes that it's an important part of our economy.
So tell me then, since that's changed and we've seen it, and in fact, my dad was telling a story. One of the first podcasts we did here was my dad came. He's 90 now,
Wow.
and he was telling stories about Davies and Schramsberg and the when they released the Blanc de Noir for the first time, and the bottles wouldn't open. There's all kinds of fun stories. It's a totally different environment then. So. Tell me about the winemaking, since you were talking about the imagery and the smell, and just the whole process of debunging the barrels and smelling. How has that changed? Is it pretty similar, or is it the chemistry change? What's changed in the world of the winemaking side?
I think when you really boil winemaking down to its essence, it's very much unchanged for thousands of years. We're mushing up grapes. There's potentially yeast added to it, unless it's a native yeast fermentation, and we're extracting the positive aspects out of the grapes. The biggest differences that I've observed are one would be technology. There's a lot of new equipment out that allows us to, for example, sort the fruit down to just near perfect levels.
Yes, I saw this at Hess.
I mean, so we sort all of our fruit by hand. We destem it and we sort it down, and basically what we're trying to get to is just the berry. We just want just clean berries to go into the fermentation tank, and it's a lot of work for somebody to do, to pick out all the jacks. And my instructions to them are simple: if you wouldn't put it in your mouth, we don't want it in the fermentation tank.
Right.
And so that's something that's kind of intuitive for somebody to understand when they're sorting. And they can just think, well, would I eat it or not? Would I put this in my mouth? So if it's a jack or a stem or something like that, it goes out. But now
Lizard, bugs.
whatever's in there, and really our fruit comes in very clean because we're hand picking everything off our own vineyards. We own all of our own vineyards. Everything's hand picked and hand done. So
Have you always hand harvested?
we've always hand harvested and always hand sorted and done everything that way. But the technology of being able to destem a little bit more effectively, that it just helps us to do the same work maybe a little bit more quickly. Even though the work's the same, we can hand sort through a little bit more tonnage when we're able to destem more effectively.
So I get it, right? Because the industry is thousands and thousands of years old. Downstairs on the wall, I have a couple of wine facts, and they found this winery in Armenia that's 6,000 years old that still had sandals and amphora there. And it sounds like to me then with Monticello Vineyards that you have practiced and are practicing, the least touch points to the extent of, this whole biodynamic movement, organic movement, all these things that are sort of the forefront of the wine consumer side of things. Harvesting by hand is one of these things that people want to see, apparently. Potentially hand picked, this hand sorting, because this machine I saw at Hess, I don't know how many lasers it has, but it would, it was like a coin sorter, right?
Yeah,
Throws the
these
pennies on
new
one side.
optical sorters are unbelievable.
They're phenomenal.
I mean, the technology inside those things is insane.
But when it comes down to it, we still have to crush a grape, certain ripeness, and ferment it and bottle it under. Make sure it's as good as the earth gives us.
That's right. We tend to adhere to some pretty old school principles in our grape growing and winemaking, and even how we run our business. So in terms of the winemaking, we want to keep things as simple as we can. I think one thing that my brothers and I talk about is there's not really a lot of skill or artistry in taking a simple thing and making it complicated. Anybody can do that.
Yeah, well, I do that every day.
But taking something that's complex and simplifying it, getting it down to its essence and simplifying it, that does take skill and artistry. And so wine is a very complex process to grow and to make. And so we want to keep things as simple as we can. We want to have the least amount of touches as possible, as you mentioned. Some of the biggest decisions for me in winemaking, one of the primary decisions, is when we're going to pick the grapes. It really dictates the style of the wine that we're going to make. Is it going to be a big, rich, jammy Cabernet, for example, or are we going to try and make something that's got a little bit more lighter berry or floral aromas? So I do all of my grape sampling myself. So there's a handful of things that I insist on doing with my own two hands, and one of them is sampling the grapes. So when I'm walking through the vineyard, I've got a little Ziploc baggie, and I'm walking through, and I'm picking 150, 200 grapes into each baggie for any given block. It's not so much the sample that's important to me. It's the process of sampling that matters to me. It's pulling the berry off the vine, seeing how easy was it to pull the grape off of the pedicel, off of the stem. When I put that berry in my mouth, because I'm constantly chewing on the berries while I'm walking around, did the skin pop in my mouth? Was it soft and velvety? When I take the seed out, is it green? Is it brown? Did the flesh separate from the seed easily? So usually by the time I'm done sampling a given block, I already know if we're ready or not. I take the sample bag into the lab and we run analysis, but a lot of times that analysis is just for historical context. I've already intuitively and in a very tactile way already decided if we're going to pick or not, or if we need to wait another week or two.
Now I'm not sure that that's always been the case. Maybe early on in winemaking, not talking about early on, way before even Napa was famous, but it seems like maybe it got away from that into more lab analysis and pH and RS and all that, right? Brix, and then now back to a tactile, visual assertion as its ripeness, phenol ripeness.
Yeah, we run a lot of analysis on our grapes and on our wines. The analysis for me is more important over a long-term context. It helps us to have metrics on the wines and on the grapes over a longer period of time, so that we can make sure that the practices we're doing are optimal. But really, all of our decisions that we make in terms of grape growing and winemaking, a lot of them are done, almost all of them are done by feel. So I put my blends together by taste. We make picking decisions by feel. When we're doing pump overs in the tank or doing punch downs in small bins, I'll go out to the bin, stick my hand down into the bin. I want to feel what that cap feels like. Is the wine warm? I want to feel the strength of the yeast activity on my arm. Is there a lot of effervescence going up my arm? And it's unbelievable when you've been doing this long, how much information you can tell, for example, just by sticking your hand into a fermenting bin of Pinot Noir, and the rush of aromas that come out when it's released from the cap. You can tell almost everything you need to know just by doing that.
That's amazing.
But I'll add that in addition to that, we're also checking Brix and temperatures every day.
Well,
and
I think
of
for
course
lab
we're
analysis,
keeping.
You have that capability.
Yeah.
I'm wondering now, if we go back to the ancient days of winemaking, if that's not exactly what they were doing in the first place.
I'm sure it was. They wouldn't have had analysis to run. They would have been winging it, and they would have kept their notes on some hieroglyphic wall on a cave or something. But they probably had their tasting notes in hieroglyphics on the side of the wall.
We have to learn how to read those. More education. Actually, it's funny because one of the best wine classes, so to speak, I went to was a Burgundy, Albert Bichot Burgundy house, and he had brought rocks and pieces of the where the tap roots were actually touching in Burgundy, and the first time ever, it was explained to me why across the street in Burgundy that you can have these little plots, a few hectares of planting, and it changes across the street because of the way the earth is shifted. And I asked the question, how did the monks know this? Because these little appellations were carved out a long time ago, and they said it was just known. It was just through experience, through exactly what I think you're talking about. When they put their hand in the must, or when they put their hand in the fermentation, they would feel and see things. So one of the conversations I had recently with a pure, this is a rustic biodynamic farm in Paso, and he's talking about the tactile differences in the thickness of the skins when they even foot crush. Okay, so he goes, but there's a huge difference in the thickness of the skins, even from vineyard to vineyard, as to what you are getting from the grape and the soil. So you sense that as well, it seems like.
Yeah, we can see that. For example, our State Lane vineyard that's up in Yountville, the grapes are some of our smallest Cabernet grapes, so tiny berries with fairly thick skins. It makes a really deep, inky, dark, concentrated wine. In contrast to the Yule Vineyard Cabernet, it's the same clone. Yule Vineyard is up in St. Helena. The grapes are a little bit bigger. The skins aren't quite as thick. It makes an equally beautiful wine, but it's just not as dark and tannic and intense as Estate Lane. So they're both wonderfully beautiful wines, but with a little bit of a different personality.
Well, his our sound engineer here, his father was able to legally get a couple of vines from silver oak.
Oh,
I don't
wonderful.
know. He was up there, and the guy were planting the saplings, and the guy goes, "Here, take whatever you want." So he took 4 or 5. Now he planted them in Glendale.
Ah, neat.
So I'm trying to tell his father, I don't think that you're going to get quite the, because it's the soil and the sun. But we've been laughing about it. It's pretty funny. But the clusters are coming out. They're actually
awesome.
pretty good. Yeah. Glendale appellation, I don't think it's valid.
Well, it might fly.
Yeah, who knows? Who knows? So I'm interested too in the volume. You on the web you have 15,000 cases. You said you're making 16 to 18 now, and then when you replant, you're going to be. Are you replanting with more density in the vineyard? What are you doing that's going to bring that up to 20,000?
What it is our replanting process it's a slow process. So we don't just tear out the whole vineyard and plant the whole thing all over again. So we're replanting in phases, and we're sort of reshifting the location of some of the varietals on the property. It's a little bit like those Chinese puzzles that you move the little squares around inside. But to do that with a vineyard could take 10 or 12 years. So historically, we've had Chardonnay and Pinot Noir planted in the back of the property, closer to the Napa River, and we've had challenges with Pierce's disease, which is a big problem across the state of California. And for us, we've observed more pressure with Pierce's disease closer to the river. So in general, what we're doing is moving the Chardonnay and the Pinot Noir up towards the front of the property, and we're moving more of our Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc into the back of the property. And we're also going to plant a very small amount of Malbec and Petit Verdot for blending. But that replanting process obviously impacts our production. So we've been kind of hovering around 15,000. We'll be at about 16,000 to 18,000 over the next year or two. And then when the vineyard's fully planted, when we're all done, it should be around 25,000.
Well, this is a pretty big jump.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to peel up back a little bit different.
Okay.
I was a local politician to a certain extent here in Arcadia. My mom was the city councilwoman in Palos Verdes Estates in 1976, the very first woman. And I had a gentleman here from Montefalco in the Umbria district of Italy, and he was the mayor. But I've never asked this question. I've never even delved into it. But I'm wondering, how does St. Helena, as being sort of the heartthrob of Napa, there's Napa proper, is it a city on its own? Have its own council and mayor kind of thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Napa has its own city council, as does St. Helena.
And so, what is the local is it a congenial politics down there? Or do people have their definite directions that people want to see the city go, and that there's some, not going to say volatile, but even in this town of Monrovia, we have some pretty heated up council meetings. Is the wine industry? This is what I'm trying to say. Participate in that part of the business?
Yeah.
Part of the city?
Yeah, St. Helena, it's such a small town, it's hard not to have an opinion, and frankly, it's hard for some people not to be involved. There's just such a small amount of people living there.
So you need somebody, right?
Yeah, I would say in general, just to be really general, it kind of breaks down into two camps. People that are sort of pro tourism, the people that want to have the businesses that can be built up and want to welcome the tourists in, and then the other camp would be the people that get kind of frustrated with all the traffic and see the problems with tourism, meaning all the traffic and whatnot. So that tends to be the two primary
factions,
lines of thought.
Now, Yountville is a separate town, or does it have a council or not?
Yountville is a separate town, and I think that they have their own council.
And then Napa, of course, is big and has its own things going on, which has its own politics to deal with it. Yeah. But it just seems interesting to me. I was having a conversation with a casino owner in Vegas, and in Las Vegas, the city council of Las Vegas has no authority over the Strip. Isn't that interesting?
That is interesting.
There's too much money there, I suppose, to give
guys are a little too powerful to
to local politicians, but obviously not the same as St. Helena. But Calistoga,
they've got their own council, and
you said there were about 7,000 people in St. Helena or something like that.
Yeah, it's a pretty small town. Yountville's even smaller.
It is.
It's absolutely. I've lived in Napa Valley my entire life, and it's still unbelievable to me the amount of high quality restaurants.
It is
the density in Yountville for such a tiny town.
Would you consider that the restaurant business is difficult no matter what? My daughter's a baker in New York, and she's tied to the industry. My wife's cousin owns a restaurant here in Pasadena. It's been 30 years, which is pretty amazing for any restaurant. But in Napa, being that it's seasonal, probably tourism is very important.
Yeah, we're busy sort of I don't know, April through the end of October. That's kind of our busiest season.
It's hard to keep a restaurant, especially the quality. We were at the Press when we were up there recently, and we went to the Restoration Hardware restaurant in Yountville, which is amazing. Pretty good.
Well, and we've had a few restaurant closures just in St. Helena recently. I mean, wonderful places. Terra restaurant, Cindy's Backstreet Kitchen. I mean,
I know
just
that.
Fantastic restaurants, and it was a real shame to see them close down. But,
not sure it's as tough as the wine business.
You know, the wine business has its challenges and an awful lot of rewards. It also is a seasonal business. You know, in terms of running the business, we have a lot more expenses during harvest time, as you can imagine. A lot of expenses associated with harvest time, crush, overtime, lots of increased labor and whatnot. And then the sales can be seasonal as well.
So this is important. This is an interesting question. It seems you mentioned the price of land in the 60s and 70s, obviously considerably less, and maybe exponentially less because of its tourism destination now. It seems rather difficult, and I'm looking at from my own industry, this direct-to-consumer. She's flooded now with people. We were talking about the Groupon guys and $45 for 15 wines and a free corkscrew, and it's just everybody's out there clamoring, and so it seems almost impossible without a substantial amount of backing to go into Napa, buy up some land, and then start a winery and try and get this brand developed and on the street. With today's numbers.
That's absolutely right. It's a very difficult industry, very expensive industry to get into at this time. And if you're going to do it on any sizable scale, you need to start with a big investment. I mean, the wine industry is getting into the wine business is challenging anyway, because you have such long product cycles. I mean, if we're making Cabernet, for example, you plant your vineyard, it's going to take you 3 or 4 years to get your grapes up to speed, maybe 5 or 6. You got a couple of years of winemaking. Maybe you're going to keep it in the bottle for another year after that. So, you get started, you might have 6 or 7 years before anything starts coming back in.
Just cash out.
And there's a lot of different business models, but almost all of them include putting a fair bit of money in before you start getting anything out. And that's even more difficult now in today's Napa.
And then getting market presence seems to be, virtually impossible. They've gone from 4,000 suppliers or wholesalers in America down to like 700. And that you do business with a wonderful group, and because of your long tenure, your status, you probably have a lot of client, restaurants and stores that, we're going to have Monticello in no matter what. But to get shelf presence even seems these days to be tough. Impossible.
We're a modest-sized winery, so for us, our advantages and what we strive for is good relationships. We found that to be the best possible avenue for us to get our wines out to people. We're not going to fight people on the lowest possible price, and we don't have the kind of volume that bigger wineries have to make all the big deals or to really kind of throw their weight around to get shelf space. So we really rely on relationships, and it's our relationships with our brokers, our distributors. I'm down in Los Angeles right now for these 3 days, spending some time with our distributor here, visiting accounts, talking to them about the wines, sharing our stories about our family, about our history in the valley. And that's what's really important to us, to make that connection to the distributors and to the accounts themselves, so they can understand that there's something a little bit deeper. Because when you just look at a bottle of wine, it's got a label. All the bottles without labels are all pretty much the same. So you got a label on it, and it's not always possible to tell a story about 50 years of family winemaking on the back label.
No, it's kind of hard. I've written some of those back labels.
You need a huge back label.
Yeah, exactly.
So getting out into the marketplace, visiting with people, making sure that we're maintaining good relationships. That's what I mean by kind of the old school.
That is old school.
Getting face to face with people, visiting with them, talking about it.
It seems to me, and this is going to the business side a little bit, because of this influx of private labels, what they call white labels now. These guys are bringing in 50,000 gallon bladders of, who knows what from Europe, putting under different brands. that the experience of the story and the history of Napa and anywhere else that you're growing grapes is a very important part of the experience. And I've only learned this recently, and you've been around it all your life. Even though I worked in the store, look at this, in 1975.
Yeah, I love that. It's really cool.
My appreciation for the history of wine and what it does for the soul is really relatively new. And it's fascinating me every day, and particularly some of this biodynamic organic stuff, because it's part of the story too. We were talking about, natural doesn't mean anything necessarily, but you are tactically involved with the harvest, you're tactically involved with the ripeness, you're tactically involved with everything that's going on in the vineyard. And that is also the story. That's a very important part of, I think, what makes people feel something when they taste your wines.
Yeah, it does make a big difference. And, thinking about organic and biodynamic farming, we own 3 vineyards in Napa Valley and work with 2 others. 2 of those vineyards are certified organic, and the third one we farm organically, although it's not yet certified. In terms of natural wine, you're right, it's kind of a vague word that can mean different things to different people. But for us, being responsible with our land and with our grapevines is really important to us. I mentioned earlier that I walk through and sample all these grapes myself. After veraison, I'm walking through the vineyard almost every day, plunking grapes in my mouth. So I'm sticking my hand into the canopy, pulling grapes out. I'm chewing on these things. So I don't want a bunch of
You don't want a bunch of
I don't want a bunch of
pesticides.
junk on the vines.
The kids are playing up there.
Yeah, the kids are out there. My dog's walking around sometimes. So it's we don't want anything out there that's going to be problematic for us. So we want to be as careful as we can. So farming organically for us. Funny enough, it hasn't been something that we've really promoted that we do, but it is important to us. I think it's important to a number of people, but all of the grapes that we're working with are organically farmed. And in terms of the wine feeding the soul, there's a lot of truth to that. So we've been talking a lot about our terroir, and that's something that's very important to us on our property. And one of the concepts that's been really important to me over the last couple of years is that we're part of that terroir. So when I hear a lot of talk about natural wines, I think, well, the natural course for a grapevine is to turn its grapes into vinegar. That would be that would be the natural endpoint for grapes that did something without intervention.
Right.
But we're making wines, and we're making them, we aspire to make them on an enlightened level. So that takes people, that takes sort of that enlightened philosophy and that enlightened thought to get into the vineyard, to choose the clones, to decide how we're going to trellis and train the vines, when we're going to pick, how we're going to approach the winemaking. So I feel very strongly that we as a family are part of that terroir. We're not something that's interfering with it. We're people that are interacting with the terroir, and we're part of it, and I would say an important part of it. And if there was a different family on this property for the past 50 years, I think the expression of the wines probably would be different.
That's a really good point.
Than what our family has expressed. So I don't think terroir is as simple as a thing of just this is the dirt and this is the climate and this is the soil and people get in the way. I think I totally disagree with that. I think that the interaction of the people on the land, done responsibly and done in a thoughtful and intentional way, is critical to creating the highest expression from a given piece of property.
That's a really, really good point. That even if it's organic all the way across, but you change the players, and you're going to get a different wine. And when Molly Hill was in here from Sequoia Grove, and I had told her we're going to talk about natural wine, I just wrote an article for LinkedIn, and my wife said, you didn't even. I moved all around, and I would start with natural and I had biodynamic organic, but I took the whole 1,000 words and I just talked about this concept of natural because of the FDA and all, definition, for instance, for natural flavorings is really kind of stupid anyway. But the point being, she said, really, if you think about it esoterically, farming anything is unnatural because you've now manipulated the nature to do something. So it's a touch point just to plant the grapes and put them in things. So in order to mitigate as much intervention as possible, once you've farmed and once you've planted, now it's our job to get out of the way and or just guide things to, as you're saying, how our family interacts with the terroir and creates the product that it does. Because you take that concept, and I had our young Armenian winemaker in here, and she's like, what other product can you produce from the soil and the earth and in your hands and take across the world and still represent, that part of the world, right? I thought, well, that's a fascinating concept, right? Because it does.
It's interesting.
It goes, isn't that great?
Well, and Molly's right on a philosophical level. Any touch point sort of, I guess, negates naturality.
Right.
But it really depends on. I guess it depends on what the motivation is of the wine grower or the winemaker. So if the motivation is to make something as natural as possible, that's perfectly fine. That's a great motivation.
Sure.
That might be a different motivation than making the highest expression or an enlightened expression. If we think about some of the beautiful music that's been created in the world over the years, you think of, well, somebody had to cut down a tree and build a piano for Mozart to create these beautiful songs, and
right.
They had to create the strings and the keys and all this stuff. So I think to create these enlightened expressions of whatever we work with, in our case wine, it requires a certain level of human expression.
You have to, right?
It has to be there. Yeah.
It's fascinating. We could probably talk for hours, and we're closing in on 45, 50 minutes here. I do want to touch one thing, and what's what I've recognized over the years. I've always been fascinated by the wines, and always seek to taste them whenever I can. I don't.
Thank you.
And like I said, we featured the 92 Pinot Noir in 1995, which is the first. Let's see. Well, that would be my fourth year doing this. So anyway, but there's always been a wonderful extraction and backbone to your wines. There's been this. I always know what I'm going to get, and that's a very important part. And not from obviously the particular character of that particular vintage, but stylistically, I know when I open a bottle of Monticello wines, I'm going to have a certain character that I'm expecting. That's why I like them.
Well, we strive for that, for consistency, and specifically with our reds, we're making 5 different vineyard designated Cabernets now, and our reserve Cabernet,
Cool.
Our proprietary red wine, and you're right, all of those wines do have a pretty firm backbone that we build them upon. That's a taste preference of our family. It's a style that we developed quite some time ago, and the wines age wonderfully as a result. I kind of laugh sometimes. I think a lot of our wines get consumed a little bit too early. I just had a bottle of our 2004 Corley proprietary red wine last night with dinner, and decanted it, had it with a wonderful dinner at a place called Love Salt down here.
Great restaurant.
Manhattan Beach.
Love and Salt.
But that 2004 is a blend of Cabernet Franc, Merlot, and Cabernet Sauvignon. It still had so much life in it.
Wow.
And it's one of the beautiful things about where our primary vineyards are, is we can get the fruit fully ripe, get into those really nice ripe flavors and aromas, dark berries, but we still maintain really good acidity. And I think that helps us to make wines that, if you have an affinity towards a little bit of a bigger wine, they taste great in their youth. But even 15 years later, this 2004 is tasting wonderful last night. I think it's got another 10 years to go. I mean, it had so much freshness in it.
I can't imagine. I don't think I've had the opportunity. I have to go back in the archives and see if we have any, because I could imagine that. Even the Pinot, I could imagine having substantial life.
It's as I mentioned earlier, Napa Valley was a very different place in the 70s. So we were at the southern end, but we get a breeze that comes through our vineyard in Oak Knoll District every single day during the growing season. So when it gets really hot up in Calistoga, all of the hot air rises at the north end of the valley, and it sucks in the cool air from the top of San Pablo Bay.
Yeah.
And we're the beneficiaries of that. Carneros gets the same wind effect. It's really, really important because it cools down the grapes in the afternoon. So it's not unusual for us to have a 50-degree shift. We could have a 90-degree, 95-degree day, and maybe a 50-degree night. So we have a huge temperature shift.
Which the grapes love.
And it's perfect. I mean, it's what makes Napa Valley special, what makes our vineyard special. But being able to retain that acidity, to keep the flavors and the aromas fresh, and to be able to make a wine like the 2015 Pinot Noir, that has very nice ripe strawberry, medium cherry tones, cola tones, but also has some really nice floral tones on the nose.
Yeah, the nose is great.
And has a fresh acidity, but still has a pretty full mid-palate. To have that kind of balance in a Pinot Noir out of Napa Valley, we're very proud of that.
Speaking of that, actually, we were there May, like the day that Highway 29 got flooded, you couldn't move.
Oh, yeah.
So when we probably drove right by the vineyard, and it was probably flooded.
Well, the rain in May was crazy.
So how did that affect the bud break?
The big concern for everybody was, at what stage your vines would be in. If they're going through flowering and you get a rain like that, that could be a big problem. Washes off all the pollen while the grapes are flowering and could create a bad fruit set. So the biggest problem there is it has a negative effect on the size of the crop and also the way the clusters develop. We were concerned about that during the rain. Now that the rain has passed and we've seen the fruit set, personally we got through that okay, and we're very happy about the way all the clusters set. So I don't think that rain's going to have a negative impact on us.
Because it was I think there was no leafing at the time, and it was still dormant. Look, they seem to be dormant still, which as long as the water runs off.
Rain during
down.
the dormant season. That's we encourage it. We need to get the reservoirs filled up and get some water into the ground. And
we needed that around here too.
We're happy with that. But when things happen, after the vines start growing and the shoots get growing, then rain can be a little bit of a challenge.
Well, I hope you have a wonderful Southern California
thank you.
Rest of your trip. You've been so far to some great restaurants. What's the next stop for you? I think you're headed to
today I'm going to be roaming around North Hollywood with
NoHo.
Yep, with Bill from Free Run Juice. That's our distributor here.
Nice guy.
And we're going to spend some time around North Hollywood today, and then tomorrow I'm working with a guy named Pearson. We'll be around the Beverly Hills area. So it's been a great visit. Spend 3 days with 3 different reps, and it's been fantastic.
That's great that you do that and you get down and shake some hands and talk wine and
it's really important.
Build those relationships, because I can tell. One of the things before we finish, what I've noticed at the markets, particularly the chain supermarkets, it's starting to look like Procter and Gamble in the toothpaste aisle, right? So everybody's, the same brands are out there. The consumers, I so desperately want to walk up to somebody that's standing in front of the wall and say, what are you looking for? Maybe I can help you, right? Yeah. Because what we do here is taste everything we can get our hands on, and we can tell you that $10 cab is actually better than that $40 cab, or vice versa, as far as just quality. So, but I feel bad for the consumer, because they're being inundated on the web with crazy offers for stuff, and it's just junk. I mean, it really is junk. And maybe I'm not done with this conversation. Going back to the experiential part of wine, and I truly and honestly believe this, and it comes from a lot of experience and a lot of questions and a lot of comments from people. But one is, my wife, for instance, doesn't go home and drink wine at night because she wants to catch a buzz, though it is a occupational hazard. But it's to disconnect and to reconnect, and to change the direction of her life for that day. And you drink Heineken because it tastes like Heineken, you drink Jim Beam because it tastes like Jim Beam, but you drink wine because you want to have this almost ethereal experience, right? Sure. And the highlight of that is, the most easiest holistical way to look at this is somebody that calls me or sends me texts from Italy saying, I just had this wine at the restaurant, can you buy this for me? And I get it from them, and they say it doesn't taste the same when they get it. And I'm saying, that's because you're not in front of the Parthenon, with the pizza, right? Yeah. And that's a rather gross example, but it's a real example.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, there's so much of the experience that enhances our enjoyment of any given wine. And we were just talking about this yesterday. We were talking about specific vintages, and sometimes people, they've got to have that specific vintage. Well, it might have been their wedding year, it might have been something like that. There's other aspects of our enjoyment about the wine, and for me, wine is such a social beverage.
It is.
It's just something that you can talk about. It changes in the glass. So you had mentioned like Heineken and Jim Beam. Well, if you drink a bottle of Heineken, it tastes the same from the top of the bottle to the bottom of the bottle, and it's supposed to. And Jim Beam, maybe it's going down in a shot, and you're trying not to taste it. Who knows? But with wine, like last night's a good example. We had this 2004 proprietary red wine. The wine was changing over the course of the entire dinner. Fantastic. It was just beautiful. And so over the course of the entire bottle and the entire time during dinner, we can talk about that wine and how it's changing. And geez, now I'm getting more coffee notes or more chocolate notes, or now the dark berries are really starting to come through. Tannins are softening, but it's evolving almost to the point where you get to the end of the bottle and you wish you had a bigger bottle, because
you want to see where it's going to go.
What's it going to do the next hour?
Yeah. Well, that goes with this same comment is, if you buy 15 wines for $40 on Groupon, the experience of opening that wine, let's just face it, at some point it does matter, what it costs to produce and what you're paying for it. And so the experience isn't a good experience when you have to say, well, that's not bad, or it's okay, or you tell your friend that you're having dinner with, hey, I got it for $3. That's not the experience, right? The experience is what you're talking about. And so it has to be deeper and longer and feel better than that. I also have been preaching that the experience for wine consumption is not that you answered 5 questions on the web. Do you drink black coffee and salt your food? And now I'm going to choose wine for you. Because for me now, after all these years, the opportunity to experience different parts of the world right at my own home has become a real fascination.
Sure.
And so Sandra and I, my wife and I, were in New York over the weekend, and I was tasting at, well, the thing was called the Leading Wines of the World. It may have been a misnomer for the name of the tasting, but what it was winemakers from all over the world, wineries seeking distribution in the United States. So none of them were represented here. And I spent most of my time at a table about this size, which was Moldavian. And part of it was Macedonian. And I was fascinated by this.
No, that's wild.
Yeah, and so we had a great chat with some interesting people. They were planting Bordeaux varietals and staying away from their indigenous stuff. And I all around was Côte d'Aron and New Zealand and South Africa. But I'm like stuck at this table trying to figure out what these things were. And to me, that's what the wine experience should be. It should be these conversations you had over your 2004.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the joy of it, and it's constantly changing. So you had mentioned our wines have a good consistency from year to year, but they still, if we sat down, for example, and tasted a vertical of our Corley Reserve Cabernet Sauvignon, there would be strong consistency throughout all those vintages. But there would also be differences that would be worth talking about. From let's say a hot vintage like 2004 and a slower, cooler vintage like 2005, just back to back. So even though the finished wine's consistent, there's still these differences in the vintage that create great conversations.
Which is part of it.
Yeah, that's a big part of it.
Keep up the good fight, Chris. We appreciate you coming in and saying hi and having a chat. Went a little longer than I want to, but I think we could do this again for another hour. So I appreciate the time.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thank you.
Cheers.